ではそろそろお揃いになられましたようなので、これから後半部分を始めたいと思います。それでは白井さんよろしくお願いいたします。
お二人の先生のお話をいただきまして、ここから、若干時間が押しましたけれども、予定では4時までですね、若干のディスカッションをしようと思っております。予定より遅れてはいるんですが、実は今回お二人のご講演内容を拝見しまして、非常に内容が濃かったんですね。なので、予定に合わせて内容を縮めるよりもちゃんとお話をしていただいた方が良いだろうということで、実はかなり確信犯で時間を遅らせていたということでございます。何人かの方から教えていただいたんですが、この話をどうやってあなたはまとめるんですかって本当にまとめにくいのでございますが、そういったこともありまして、若干短めにということでございます。私改めまして白井と申します。私はもともと日本よりも実は東アジアの考古学を勉強しておりまして、そういう意味ではよその文化の研究をしたものの一人としてなぜか日本代表でここにいるという状況でございます。今日のお配りした資料の中で、私のことは書いてあるので自分のことは恥ずかしいのであまり申しませんが、残念ながら若干記述に誤りがございまして、私はこちらのお二人の先生とは違って博士号は持っておりませんので、文学博士というところにだったらいいなと書いておりますね。さて、それではですね、先ほどもご指摘がありました通り、非常に多くのご質問をいただいております。とても全部というわけにはまいりませんが、まずこの討論のかなりの部分はですね、このご質問の内容をお二人の先生に示しましてですね、そのお答えをいただくというところから始めようと思います。まずサイモン・ケイナー先生にですね、のご質問に対するご質問についてですね、いくつか取り上げていこうと思うんですけれども、ガウラントに関する非常に興味深いお話をいただいたんですが、その中でとても記述が細かい、それがその後の日本考古学の基本といいますかですね、一つのお手本になるぐらいのものであるというお話は分かったんですが、やはりちょっとご質問の中でですね、ちょっと危惧をされている部分がございまして、例えばこういった出土品をですね、記録し報告する、これには学問でありますから客観性が必要でございますが、よその国の文化に関する記録というものについて、文化の背景の違いなどが原因でですね、誤って記録してしまうということはないのか、あるいはそういった危惧に対してですね、私たちはどういうふうに対処すればいいのかと、なかなかいきなり難しい質問なんですが、お考えをお教えいただければ幸いです。
Well, thank you for giving me an easy question to start with. I think that one of the very interesting things for me about Gowland is that he brought a critical appreciation to the material he was working with. One of the criticisms about Gowland is that it took him a very long time to produce his reports. I sympathize with that. But as a result of him spending a long time thinking carefully about what he had been recovering from the tombs, it meant that the final report that he produced were, I think, some of the most carefully considered publications about Japanese archaeology that any foreign archaeologists were writing. Now, I'm not biased because Gowland's British and Morse is American or anything like that, but Morse published very rapidly the results of his conclusions, and it was an excellent publication, the Shelvins of Ormery. But in there, he drew some conclusions which we now realise were erroneous. For example, he, and this relates to Oliver's work on animal bones maybe, he interpreted bite marks on some of the human bones as being evidence for cannibalism, suggesting that in the Jomon period, these people were eating their deceased relations. We now know that those marks probably came from dogs chewing on the bones. So I would say that Morse was rather quick to reach conclusions, with the result that later on those conclusions had to be rethought, whereas Gowland took 15 years to publish his paper. And although there are some problems, some terminological problems in particular, for example, he compared the Kofun directly with the dolmens of Neolithic Europe, and there are some problems with that. But I think one of the lessons I draw from Gowland's work is the importance of meticulous recording and the importance of spending time reflecting on the discoveries that you've made.
ありがとうございます。同じ英国人としてお答えになるとなかなか難しいこともあったかと思いますが、実はガウランドのコレクションの大英博物館に入っているものに関して実はここごく最近ですけれどもね、今も進行中ですが、日本人の研究者が何人も行ってですね、その記録とかですね、遺物の調査をされています。実は先月明治大学の博物館でその成果が報告されたんですけれども、非常に客観的なものであり、日本人の考古学にとって先進的なものだということをですね、まさに日本文化の側にいる日本人の研究者が検証をしていると、そういうことも行われているということを、これは私の方から補足をしたいと思います。そうですね、それではオリバー・クレイグ先生の方への、ご質問にも若干取り上げたいと思うんですが、実はご質問の大半は、クレイグ先生のご質問であります。ちょっと大変かもしれませんが、まずストーンヘンジでのですね、研究成果に関して、特にご質問が多かったんですけれども、その中でですね、このダーリントン・ウォールズで出土した牛について、このブリテン島のさまざまな土地からの牛が来ているんだということをおっしゃられましたが、遺跡の出土遺物はですね、この動物依存体だけではなくて、土器とか石器とかですね、むしろ私たち日本人にとって馴染み深い他の種類の遺物があると思うんですが、そういった他の遺物でもですね、地域を超えた交流を証明するようなものがあるのでしょうか。この点についてまずご指摘いただきたいと思います。
Thank you. We conducted chemical analysis of the pottery to look at the composition of the ceramic to see where it may have come from. In most cases, it included materials that were local to the area, chalk inclusions. We did some more analysis of the shell within some of the pottery to see if it was marine shell, indicating contact perhaps with the coast. But in all cases, it seemed to be fossil shell, which is in keeping with the geological environment at Stonehenge. So we can never be sure that the pottery was not transported from another chalk-rich region with a similar geology, but it's at least consistent with local pottery production around this area. So we're pretty sure that at least the ceramics were produced locally. The other artifacts, we spoke about the stone, but the lithic artifacts also appear to come from local outcrops of flint around this area, with little evidence of bringing in large amounts of these artifacts. So that's quite interesting. The animals, maybe, were harder to produce locally because it's quite an upland area with not much access to water. So one argument is that you could not keep large stocks of animal to sustain the level of consumption that was happening at Stonehenge. So perhaps they had to feed Stonehenge from a much greater area because there just wasn't the capacity to produce them locally.
ありがとうございます。今のお話によりますと、牛に関してはブリテン島のいろんなところから来ているけれども、土器や石器などは、基本的に地元のものであると。そうするとそこにはこの違いにきっと何か大きな意味があるんだろうなという今後の研究の展開が予想されるところでございます。ブリテン島の外から来ているものは何かあるんですか？ヨーロッパ大陸とか、そちらはどうでしょうか？
No, in fact, because at least from the artifact styles, what we seem to be seeing at this period in British history is a very specific British collection of artifacts or style of artifacts manufacture. The pottery that dates from the same parts in northern France, which is the closest part of continental Europe to the site, is very, very different in style and in manufacturing process. One of the things that some archaeologists have been very keen to point out, in this period of Neolithic Britain, we seem to have this sense of a united kingdom of Britain, a united Britain, which is distinguishing itself, perhaps for the first time, from the rest of the continent. So that we find very little evidence of anything being brought across from the nearest places like France, although people do argue for some contact during this time.
Shirai-san, すみません。ちょっといいですか？Oliver, in the museum near Stonehenge, there is a skeleton. Somebody called the Amesbury Archer, and on the label it says he came from Switzerland. So, what do you make of that?
That's a very good point, Simon. But the Amesbury Archer does not date to the same period as Stonehenge. The Amesbury Archer dates to our Bronze Age, the first arrival of metal in Britain, which is the period immediately after the Neolithic period, the Stone Age period. So we start to see, at the start, from 2000 BC, the appearance of new burial mounds, new artifacts. You mentioned some of the bell beaker burials that we start to see appearing at this time. And when it's thought to be, it's argued again, but there's some colonisation of people bringing metals into Europe at around 2000 years BC. And a lot of these burials are actually found around the Stonehenge landscape. And now what's really interesting is that these burials are a respectful distance away from the Henge monument. They're satellites around the monument. So it looks as though they have a very good knowledge of the indigenous people, the British people, and their customs, and of Stonehenge, and they're respecting that in the way that they are burying their dead. So there is evidence of continuity and respect for the previous period, but what we appear to be seeing is a very new culture coming in at the start of the Bronze Age in Britain.
まずサイモン・ケイナー先生の素晴らしいツッコミに感謝したいと思います。今のオリバー・クレイグ先生の解説も非常によくわかりまして、青銅器時代になると、大陸との関係が変わってきているという部分でありまして、その部分は東アジアの考古学を勉強している者についてはですね、常に中国大陸、朝鮮半島と日本との関係っていうのはどう変化していくかということとも関係があるわけで、ちょっと私たちにとって別の刺激になるヒントをいただいたと思います。それから新石器時代のストーンヘンジがですね、歴史的な景観として継承されていくという部分のご指摘はですね、この英国の考古学のまた日本とはまた別の側面を図らずに教えていただけたかというふうに思います。会場からいただいたご質問の中にはですね、ストーンヘンジにおける人々の儀式や信仰がどういうものだったのかということに対するご興味に関するものがあります。例えばストーンヘンジが建設された場所というのは他の場所とは違う、そもそも特別な場所だったのかどうかというご質問、それから、具体的にそこでお祭りをした人たちはどのような信仰を持っていたのかというご質問、どちらもとても難しいご質問かと思います。もし難しければいいんですが、可能な限りでこの2点についてお教えいただければと思います。サイモンさんも手助けありですからよろしくお願いします。
Of course, we know very little about the faith specifically, but we do know that these people had a great connection with the natural world around them. They were very interested in cosmology. They were very interested in the sun, the movement of the moon and the sun, and we know that from the monuments that have been constructed and the many alignments that have been found around this area. So this must have structured many aspects of their daily but also their ritual lives. And we also know that the way that they buried their dead was highly ritualized, and the monuments they produced for burying the dead were the grandest, and they must have had much interest in the concepts of the afterlife and the transformation of the dead, of the living to the dead and into the afterworld and into the world of ancestors. So these were definitely an ancestor worshipping group, and we probably can say that for most of the Neolithic period, not just the age of Stonehenge. So that aspect we are quite clear about.
Why did they build Stonehenge where they built it? I think that's a very interesting question, and there's been some, if I understand correctly, from the broad landscape approach which has been taken over the last few years. And maybe it's worth saying that the World Heritage Site is not just the stone circle of Stonehenge itself, but it's very much Stonehenge and its landscape. And what is very interesting for me about the new visitor centre and the new arrangements at Stonehenge, where after 30 years of planning, we have been able to close one road which separated the stone circle from its broader landscape. So now visitors can go and you can experience the way Stonehenge was experienced in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, instead of it being an hour and a half by bus from London to Stonehenge, 20 minutes at Stonehenge and then back to London. Now you go and spend a day walking around the broader landscape. But one very interesting finding of this broad landscape survey, many thousands of new sites have been discovered as a result of this, there's a technique called LiDAR, this kind of aeroplane mounted radar, and it allows you to look underneath the trees and underneath the bushes. Very clever. And as a result of this LiDAR survey, it seems that on a similar alignment to the stone circle, there are a series of natural ditches which are the result of activity by glaciers during the Ice Age. And it is quite likely that these features were visible in the early stages of building Stonehenge. And it made it a rather special place, even though there were no constructions there at that time. I think that's very, very interesting. And we know that in the Mesolithic period, so before the Neolithic period, there are the remains of large upstanding posts. I'm sure some of you are familiar with sites like Sannai Mariyama and Teraji in Niigata, where you have these large upstanding posts in Jomon sites. And it seems that even in the Mesolithic period, people were marking out the landscape. They were building these things in the landscape, so this is an important place for us. And I think it's very interesting if there were these original natural features that were perhaps the original draw for people to come to Stonehenge and carry out their festivals. Can I just say one last thing about the religion as well, which is that we don't know very much about Neolithic religion, that's true. But one of the things that for me, as an archaeologist practicing in the 21st century, is that every summer, hundreds of thousands of people go to Stonehenge to celebrate the summer solstice. When I was a student, there were many battles between the police and these people who wanted to get into Stonehenge. They said, this is a religious site, we should be allowed to go to that site freely at these times of the year. It was a big fuss. And I think we've learned a lot in terms of managing archaeological sites and dealing with many different religious beliefs, because there are many newly invented religions which are practiced at Stonehenge. Druidism, for example, is a 19th century invention, largely. But for many years, only the Druids were allowed into Stonehenge at the midsummer solstice. But now we have become much more tolerant of many different religious beliefs. And so now, I think, every year, for the summer solstice, everybody is allowed into Stonehenge for free. I'm afraid at other times of the year, it's about £15 now, I think. So we've been learning. I think it's very important to think about what religion means to contemporary people, as well as what it means in the Neolithic. And it continues to be a sacred site for many, many people.
ありがとうございます。それではだんだん時間もなくなってまいりましたので、ストーンヘンジのことから、少し外れまして、オリバー・クレイグ先生の縄文土器の分析に関することなどにも話を進めようと思うんですが、今日の、日本の、非常に古い縄文土器、日本だけではなくて、東アジアの非常に古い縄文土器について、最新の分析のことも含めて教えていただきました。その中で、会場のご質問にもありましたし、私自身も、あるいは会場で何人か直接お声をお聞きした方の中でもあった疑問なんですが、私などが大学で勉強した時にはですね、新石器革命という言葉を習いまして、氷河期が終わると農耕を始めて土器を作るようになると、これが人類にとってとても大きな変化であると。それが普通の歴史であって、縄文人みたいに狩猟採集社会なのに土器を作っている方が、特殊な社会であるかのように習っておりました。しかし今日のお話を伺うと、まるでそれは逆なんじゃないかという気がしてまいります。 この点につきましてオリバー・クレイグ先生がどのようにお考えなのかお伺いしたいと思います。
Yeah, there's many societies around the world who have ceramics without farming. Whether that be in North America, there's very clear cases of innovation of ceramics well before the introduction of agriculture like maize. Whether that be in Africa, where ceramics along the Nile River were introduced many thousand years before the arrival of cows. Or, for example, in East Asia, as you know, but also in China. In southern China, we have very early ceramics before the ice, during that last ice age, well before any forms of rice agriculture. And then all across Eurasia, particularly now working closely with some Russian colleagues, we see that we have very early ceramics on sites with no evidence of any domesticated plants or animals, right across the whole Eurasian continent. And then also in Europe even, and this is well known to many people who live in Northern Europe, in the Baltic countries, around, for example, Sweden or Denmark or Northern Germany, Poland and the Baltic states and Finland. Much of their early ceramic material they have is associated with hunter-gatherers. So there are many, many examples around the world. And now I think we have to ask whether the association, which I was taught as well when I studied archaeology, that ceramics are associated with farming, is actually that is more the minority. And the more common view around the world is that ceramics predated farming by many thousands of years. So I think the perceptions are changing on this, and certainly in Europe, where we're very close to working with early agriculture and ceramics, European archaeologists now need to open their eyes a bit and become more aware of these other cultures that have ceramics well before farming as well. So it is changing. Of course, here you've known this for a long time, but in Europe it is changing now and people are becoming more aware.
ありがとうございます。時間がもうほとんどなくなっておりますので、本日の本来の、テーマである、日曜交流のですね、絆に関することについても若干、お話をしていこうと思いますけれども、今日のお二人のお話は実は私もここしばらくまでよく知らなかったんですが、ガウランドがストーンヘンジの調査をしている人物だったということで、実はお二人の話がつながっているということは非常に興味深いところでございます。しかし、ご指摘にもありました通り、ガウランドはもともと本職としては考古学者ではなかったわけですね。それから今日のお話にも出てまいりましたニール・ゴードン・マンローと話はほんの短かったんですが、この人は横浜で開業医だったんですね。お雇い外国人でもないんですね。民間の開業医だったんだけれども趣味が考古学で、その成果は非常に大きいと。日本で最初に分層地層を分けて発掘するやり方、始まりがいつなのかちょっと若干問題あるんですが、それを明確な形で行ったのはマンローが最初だと言われている。グリッド法は、ガウランドで、分層発掘はマンローが非常に活躍して、でそうするとガウランドのその考古学の経歴っていうのは日本での経歴の方が古いわけですが、もしガウランドが日本に来なかったらストーンヘンジは彼は発掘しなかったんでしょうか。その日本での活動が何らか彼が指名されることに影響を与えているんでしょうか。そのあたり先生いかがでしょうか。
Well, that's a very interesting question, Shirai-san. And in fact, it's interesting for me that you say you didn't know that Gowland worked at Stonehenge. Most British archaeologists had no idea that Gowland had investigated 406 Kofun in Japan. It's one of those mysteries. The reason he was engaged to do the work at Stonehenge was because he was famous as an engineer. And he had the engineering skills necessary, a mining engineer. So he had the engineering skills necessary to get those incredibly heavy stones set up again. Maybe in Britain, he's most famous for his metallurgical analysis. And when he returned to England, he published a series of very important papers on the use of iron, bronze and lead in the Roman period, in particular working at the Roman city of Silchester. And I think actually his interest in archaeology also came from that interest in metallurgy. And it was the interest in metallurgy, the expertise in metallurgy, that got him the job at the Osaka Mint. So that's the sort of set of connections I see bringing Gowland to Japan. It's very curious for me, though, that nobody in Britain knows very much about Gowland. And there's a lovely book called Stonehenge Complete, which is supposed to be the compendium of all knowledge about Stonehenge before this new project started. And in the section about Gowland, it says, we don't know why they chose Gowland, William Gowland, to come and do this work at Stonehenge. He didn't seem to have any archaeological experience. So even in a book like that, there's misunderstandings that we need to rectify.
わかります。このようなお雇い外国人と言われる人たちですけれども、先ほど最初に紹介がありましたように、私は博物館の歴史というのを調べておりまして、ガウランドと東博は実は若干接点があるんですが、全体的にはあまり接点がないということで、他の人たちのことを調べているんですが、やはりこのガウランドや先ほどのマンローのようなですね、技術を持って本職があるんだけれども、趣味としての、考古学以外の場合もありますが、いろんな学問分野でプロに負けない能力を持った人というのがいろんな形で日本と関わっているという例がございます。私が最近知った例でございますが、フレデリック・クリスティという人がいます。知ってるよっていう人がいたらすごい人だと思うんですが、この人は新橋と横浜の間に鉄道を作った技師のうち一人です。代表者ではなくてどちらかというと無名の人物なんですが、実はイギリスから来たことになっているんですが、オーストラリアから来た人です。でこの人が日本で来て鉄道技師以外に昆虫採集をやっているんですね。でその昆虫採集のレベルが非常に高いレベルであって、その成果は今大英博物館にも寄贈されているという人でございます。でこのフレデリック・クリスティという人物がオーストラリアに帰って、でその中でオーストラリアの研究コミュニティの中で、日本の昆虫についてですね、多くの報告をして新聞に記事を書いたりしているんですね。でその影響を受けて、メルボルンの王立植物園のチャールズ・フレンチという人物がですね、この人は植物園にいるんですけど、やっぱり昆虫が大好きでですね、その知識をもとにこの東博と交渉してですね、当時の東博は昆虫とかですね、貝殻とかいっぱい集めていたところなので、その交換をしようというふうに持ちかけてくると、そういうですね、鉄道技師なんだけど昆虫学の分野で活躍した人がいて、でそれが日本と外国との交流のきっかけになっていくというような例があります。ある種19世紀におけるある種の教養の在り方なのかなと思うんですね。本職以外にもプロ並みの教養も持っているという人物でございまして、そういう点でガウランドもそういう一人として、日本の恩人の一人であるということが言えると思います。オリバー・クレイグ先生のご研究の方は、もう21世紀に主に進んだ非常に新し 研究でありますが、ストーンヘンジに関して行った研究をですね、縄文土器についても行うようになったそのきっかけについて、私たち日本人としては興味がありますので、その間の経緯をですね、お教えいただければと思います。
My interests were in hunter-gatherer pottery in Europe. So I've been working in the Baltic area, excavating and analysing pottery from shell-midden sites in these areas. And we had already conducted a lot of analysis of the pottery, showing a lot of fish on the pots as well in this area. So I became very interested in why hunter-gatherers needed pottery and how they were using pottery. And to look for another example around the world of that, obviously the Jomon was a clear example. So talking to colleagues like Simon, I became very interested in also writing to Japanese archaeologists and visiting Japanese archaeologists in Britain. I was able to set up a project with their help. But I was really keen to make the links between the Northern European archaeology and the Japanese archaeology, which in many cases are similar in the sense that they're from quite northern latitudes, quite similar environments, both have shell middens, so it was really nice to try and make that initial link. So that's what I was kind of trying to do.
ありがとうございます。研究対象としての共通性以外にいろいろな人的な関係を、西郷さんあたりがいろいろ協力をされた、そういったまさに絆にこじつけようとしているんですけれども、日本との協力がしやすい環境も整っていたと、そういうふうに無理やり解釈してよろしいですか。今後この研究はですね、さらに続いていくことと思います。
I think we now have an excellent environment for increased international cooperation. I talked about some of the things which have been happening very recently, and I hope will lead on to many more interactions. One of the nice things about this is that when you bring people together, and this is so true in Japan, you introduce people to each other, you see ideas flowing and communication flowing, and you never know what will come of that. You never know what will come of that chance meeting, that chance conversation, just by chance sitting next to somebody at dinner, or going to a conference and again by chance meeting somebody. And many of my discoveries meeting wonderful people in that way. Anything that we can do to encourage those kinds of connections. And now we have the technology. We don't understand where this technology of the internet or will lead us, to social media. What are these? I was told by Mizoguchi Koji that 10,000 people all around the world have signed up for his online course about social archaeology. Who knows, out of those 10,000 people, if only 2 or 3 continue with an interest in these areas, then we could see archaeology transformed in the very near future, I think. And I think it's rather exciting not to be able to control that. And we don't know where it's going to lead. But we do know it will lead to new things, new discoveries, and new networks, new forms of networks as well.
ありがとうございます。最後に私の博物館の歴史を研究している中で気づいたことで若干コメントしたいと思うんですけれども、19世紀 の東博はですね、ヨーロッパなど諸外国の博物館と作品の交換などのいろんな交流がございます。その時の資料を読むとですね、驚くのはですね、実はそのヨーロッパの博物館と非常に対等な交渉をしているということでございます。日本の近代化というとですね、すでに完成されたヨーロッパの文明を遅れている日本が一生懸命よく分からず習っているかのようなイメージをお持ちの方がいらっしゃるかもしれませんが、実はそうではなくてですね、ヨーロッパにとってもまだ近代になったばっかりだったんですね。でしかも19世紀の後半というのは世界中で博物館が増えてかつ拡大する時代、それと同じ時に博物館を始めたので、もちろん大博物館ではもっと古い素晴らしい博物館がありますけど、大半の世界の博物館とは全く一線でスタートして、その中で対等な関係を結んで、作品を交換する。その中さらに、付き合うのに最もこのテーマではここと付き合うのが最もふさわしいという相手を選んでいたりするんですね。これがですね、もっと一方的な、なんていうか完成された欧米を日本が習っていくというような発想はむしろ20世紀以降になってですね、起こってきて、昔からそうであったかのように勘違いをしているだけではないかというのが最近の私の思いでございます。その欧米から一方的に教えてもらっている文明を教えてもらっている日本という発想のもう一つ裏側に、外国の人に日本文化は分かるはずがないというような変な思い込み、これもやっぱり20世紀になってより強くなっているものでございます。日本が近代化に歩み始めた19世紀の資料を見ると、非常に対等でですね、もっとグローバルな人材がいっぱいいる状況でございまして、今日はサイモン・ケーナー先生に19世紀のお話をしていただいて、オリバー・クレイグ先生には21世紀の研究の話をしていただきましたが、この2つの時代はまさにいろんな文化的背景を持った人がですね、対等に協力し合ってですね、お互いが理解をし合って、いろんな研究を進める、そういう時代になっていけば良いなというふうに思っております。いただいたご質問はまだまだ多くてですね、とても消化しきれないんですが、もう時間もですね10分以上オーバーしておりますので、誠に拙い機会ではございましたが、以上をもちまして本日のディスカッションはまとめたいと思います。どうも皆さん長い時間ありがとうございました。